Hello everyone, I'm Teacher Tiger and welcome to another part of building a 7mm narrow gauge Loco kit, and this is part 4, bashing and building the Loco body kit. It's been about 8 months or so since the last part, just due to the demands of life, and this was the kit as we last saw it, which was the modification of the chassis and the slide bar and crosshead addition. I did begin to build a coal bunker, but I didn't really like the look of the Loco then. It appeared quite unbalanced to the rear, so I removed it and I'll show you what else we've done. So, an early job that needed doing was on the boiler, and in particular on top of the firebox, and I chose to remove this steam dome, which is where the safety valves are planned to be, so it was out with the trusty jeweler saw. Again, I have to say I'm not an expert, so I can only apologise if I've mislabelled or misidentified any of these parts. And once it was carefully removed and the boiler dry fitted, it looks like this, which is more the appearance I was aiming for. I then made a new buffer beam front piece, just from some plasticard, which was super glued to the front, as the moulding of the buffer beam as it was quite plain and undetailed. So once it had been cut to shape, I used a small tack and a pin hammer just to emboss some rivet detail on the front before it was clamped into place. The next job was gluing down the boiler piece to the running plate. I did make a bit of a mess of this, so the glue marks needed sanding down, and now it's dry. You can see the buffer beam piece I made with the rivet detail and the small hole I made in the front for a coupling. I then took a little bit of milliput and just went around and filled in any of the small imperfections around any of the joins around the front and sides of the smoke box. The cab front piece was then given a quick sand just to make sure all the edges were flat and square. Before out came the cyano glue again, and this was then glued in place, ensuring it was sitting flush against the back of the firebox. I made sure that it was all sitting nice and square and level using my engineer square. Once the glue had set, I dry fitted both of the cab sides and just used some blue tack to hold them in place. And it was clear there was quite a noticeable gap from the moulding process between the arch piece of the cab front and the boiler. So that was sorted out using a whole lot more milliput, which again was just applied with a sharp scalpel blade, which was then neatened up and smoothed off with a damp blade. The next modification was the side tanks, and I used these small bits of plasticard held in place with milliput to create some side tank extension pieces. This was due to the large hole that is visible between the boiler and the running plate to accommodate the size of the hornbeam motor in the chassis, and these extensions cover the hole rather well. Having dry fitted the tanks, it became clear that also there was a significant gap between the inside of the tanks and the boiler side, which again allowed you to see all the way down to the bottom of the chassis. This was covered up by adding a small strip of plasticard again, held in place by, once again, more milliput. Okay then, so looking at the cab interior as it is, it's obvious that it's quite bare and lacking in any sort of detail really. So I've decided I'm going to model a more detailed cab interior. So after doing a bit of research, I made a start by adding these two bits of plasticard to the inside of the cab sides, and I filled the gap with some shaped milliput. This piece is going to form the cab access to the coal bunker, and I did one on each side, and it was quite simply done by gluing in two small strips of balsa and a small blob of milliput between. I then rolled out a slab of milliput, laid it over the top quite carefully, trimmed off the excess with a really sharp knife, and then again wetting the blade, just smoothing it out and shaping it to the right shape and dimensions. Once this had set, the next job was to bore out an opening using the pillow drill, and then using some very thin strips of plasticard, I created these two runners down either side of the opening, and then curving a small door piece to fit, that was inserted, which creates an opening and closing door, which I thought was quite a nice little feature really. Okay, so looking at the back head of the firebox, there are these two protrusions which are supposed to be moulded representations of the boiler level water gauges. However, they are quite crude, and I'm not entirely sure how I'm going to model them as such, so I've decided to remove them. So after cutting them off with the jeweler saw and tidying it up with a sharp knife, it leaves a nice smooth and flat surface ready to add some additional detail parts that I've got to represent this a little bit better. Next, it was out with the super glue again, and both side tanks were fitted quite securely, and any gaps around the edges were just tidied up and filled in again with a little bit of milliput. I also made sure to fill in any gaps that were there between the side tank extensions and the top of the boiler, and this was all left to set and dry. And now the extra detail piece had fitted to the inside of the cab sides, they were both ready to be glued in, making sure that they were sitting flush and square, and then once again any of the little gaps or imperfections were tidied up and filled in with, just for a change, lots more milliput. So with the bulk of the kit now cured and set, it was time to add the other smaller parts included in the kit. So the first was the Loco chimney, and I removed the moulding burrs with a small drum sander. and then using a 3.2mm drill bit in the pillar drill, bored out the inside before again getting the super glue out and fitting it firmly in place on top of the smoke box and making sure it was level and straight. Next it was onto the sand dome, and again the rough moulding burrs were removed with the drum sander. That was then fitted in its chosen position. The steam dome was then given the same treatment with the drum sander and was also glued in its chosen position on top of the boiler. Following that, it was time to make some modifications to the roof, and as I've moved the steam dome, these two protrusions, which were the safety valve outlets on top of the cab roof, need cutting off, and then sanding nice and flat, nice and flush. The inside of the cab roof was then given a bit of a tidy up, just to remove any of the moulding imperfections, and then 2 strips of plastercard were added to match the curve of the roof, just to present a little bit of roof overhang, because I felt that the cab looked quite square in its intended form. So I did these just to sort of break up the sort of square block-like look, really. And then the last job was just to give the whole thing a good sand with some fine-grained wet and dry paper to smooth the surface and key it up ready for priming. Okay then, so here we have the almost completed body fitted to the running chassis. I'm quite pleased with how it looks at the moment. There are a few areas that need tidying up or filling in, but in general I'm quite pleased with how it looks. The cab roof and the cab rear are just dry fitted at the moment because, as I mentioned earlier, I'm going to be modelling a slightly more detailed cab interior with some additional detail parts that I've got hold of. So the next job is going to be fitting some of the smaller details, such as the smoke box door dart and handrails as an example, before the whole lot is primed ready for painting. It runs very well with the body fitted, and I included the new Humvee Pekka in this shot just to give an interesting comparison of the size and the scale difference. The inspiration and research for the modifications that I've done on this kit have been based on the Manning and Wardle locomotives on the Linton and Barnstaple Railway and the Davies and Metcalfe locos on the Vale of Rheidol Railway in Wales. So this might give some clues to the overall look and appearance that I'm aiming for in the final completion of this kit. Before we conclude this part, I'd just like to say a big thank you to Robert Brown for all his support and comments on previous parts of this series, and again to say a very big thank you for the link that he's placed to previous parts of this series on his RmWeb blog where he's completing a similar project. So it'd be really great if you could show your support by going over and having a look at Robert's blog and having a look at what he's up to over there. So it's time to finish this part by saying thank you very much everybody. Hope you found this useful, and I will see you all in the future soon. Thanks very much. Bye bye.